The 2000s, an era filled with iconic scorers.
Is all over. McGrady. Foul is picked up. A potential four.
And Vaughn is glued to him. I mean, he is in his shirt. And Allen's trying to bust a move on him. Wow, he breaks his ankles and drills it.
You had freaky athletic superstars like Vince Carter, who was jumping over 7'2" centers.
Bonato gets with a sloppy pass. Carter inside.
Oh!
Players who could dribble and score from anywhere on the court like Tracy McGrady, and absolute monsters like Shaq, who was bullying everybody in the NBA. But what if I told you the best offensive player in the NBA wasn't any of them? Rather, it was a skinny, unathletic white point guard from Canada called Steve Nash. He wasn't the most explosive player. He didn't have a crazy vertical. I mean, he's recorded only one dunk attempt in his whole entire career in the NBA, and it was this.
Couldn't control the ball. Here comes Nash. Takes it in on Duncan.
So basically, he never dunked. He's the complete opposite of what you expect of an NBA superstar. And there's a reason Shaq is pissed to this day that this 6'1" white point guard won 2 MVPs over him.
Was he true MVP or was he a sympathy MVP? No, he was a true MVP. Over me? Twice? Oh, get out of here. Hey.
While he wasn't the biggest or the most athletic player in the NBA, Steve Nash was one of the most efficient shooters ever, all the while orchestrating one of the best offensives at the time, or just ever. There are people who call him the original Curry, but I think that doesn't do his playmaking justice. I think the better comparison is a combination of Curry's shooting with the playmaking of Chris Paul. What makes all of this even more crazy was that basketball wasn't even his first sport, or second, or third, because this man was talented in a bunch of different sports like lacrosse, rugby, and soccer as a young kid. Where he was the most talented in though was soccer. By his junior year, he would be named British Columbia's most valuable player, and there was a good chance if he kept at it, he could have gone pro and even start in the Canadian national team. That probably would have been the case if not for the fact that in middle school, he started playing basketball with his friends. While he was much more talented in other sports, he started to dream of playing in the NBA. All the odds would be stacked against him though. He was much more smaller than other players and much more inexperienced compared to others who started playing earlier than Nash. Steve though wouldn't let that hold him back. He would outwork everybody, and by his senior year, he would average almost a triple-double, averaging 21, 9, and 11. You would think that with numbers like that, every university would be interested in him, right? No, his coach sent Steve's game tape to more than 30 universities and wrote and called up more than 20, telling them that he could easily play D1, but none of them were having it, except for one. You might be wondering why, and it came down to where Steve was from, Canada, because this was 1992, where there was a very few Canadian NBA talent. When Nash was a senior in college, the only Canadian players in the NBA were Bill Wennington and Rick Fox, both of whom played high school basketball in America. So when universities got sent the tape of an unathletic 6'1" player dominating in Canada, they probably thought that's his peak. Good enough to dominate Canadian high school players, but not good enough to play D1 in America. But there was one university that did believe in Steve Nash, that being Santa Clara, whose best player ever before was Kurt Rambis. Santa Clara was one of the universities that received this game tape from Steve's high school coach, and when their assistant Scott Graydon watched his tape, he would at first laugh because of how bad Steve's competition was. But after watching more of his tape, he would come to realize despite his competition, Nash was a great player in his own right. Graydon would hype up Steve to the head coach Dick Davey, which prompted Davey to fly to Canada to watch Steve play in the tournament. Davey was worried though. He thought the tournament would be filled with scouts and recruiters trying to get Steve to join their university. Luckily for Davey, there was no other American coaches in attendance, so he would offer Nash a scholarship to join Santa Clara under one condition. Steve needed to become a more complete player because Nash was one of the worst defenders he's ever witnessed, and Nash would reply in his usual ambitious attitude saying he was willing to do whatever was needed to improve. Steve would start his university career off the bench, but he would improve fast. And by the end of the season, he would lead the team to win the WCC tournament and be named the tournament MVP. This tournament win would earn them a spot in the NCAA tournament, where they would be the 15th seed taking on the number 2 seeded Arizona in the first round. Santa Clara would pull off the impossible in this game, as they would lead by 3 points near the end of the game, which would force Arizona to foul their best free throw shooter, Steve Nash. And knowing Steve Nash, he would make his next 6 straight free throws to send Santa Clara through to the next round. This end of the season run from Steve Nash would continue on to the next season and the season after, as by his junior year he would average 20.9 points and 6.4 assists while shooting 45.4% from the 3. By this point, he was thinking of entering the NBA draft, but after being projected to go in the second round, he decided to bet on himself and return to school to improve his projection. This bet would pay off, and by the end of the year, he would have his best season yet, as he was named honorable mention as an All-American and was projected to go in the first round. Where in the first round though was still in the question, as there was still massive doubts about Steve Nash, mainly about his athleticism and size. Even though he's proven he could play with the best of them in D1, he was still seen by some as this small, unathletic white point guard who could be a decent role player if he developed accordingly. While Steve had plenty of doubters, he had at least one believer in Donnie Nelson, who had known Steve for a decent while because his friend Coach Shields was Steve's Canadian coach. Donnie Nelson would keep track of Nash throughout his university career, and by the time he entered the draft, Nelson believed he could be a starter in the league, or at the very worst, a great bench piece. With this in mind, he would tell another assistant coach, Danny Ainge, about the young Canadian, and soon Nash would fly up the draft board in Phoenix. The night before the draft, the Suns owner would come up to Nelson and ask if he was sure about Steve, and Nelson replied by saying he could fire him if Nash turned out to be a failure. As Suns pick at 15 rolled around, Steve was still on the board, so he would be their selection at that spot. And immediately after being drafted, Steve would be met with boos by the team's fans. The Suns at this time needed a big man, but instead, their team would draft a skinny Canadian point guard from a no-name university, so understandably, the fans were dissatisfied. On top of that, Steve would be behind another talented point guard in Kevin Johnson to start his career, but he would fall even further down the depth chart because the Suns would soon trade for Sam Cassell, who would soon be flipped for Jason Kidd. So now, Nash would be behind 2 all-star point guards. So understandably, he would barely play in the first year, only averaging 10.5 minutes a game. In his second season though, he would get a bigger role to prove his worth, and he would impress this season, as he was now a valuable piece off the bench, as he got 21 minutes a game while scoring 9 points on very good efficiency, shooting 86% from the free throw and 41.5% from the 3. Just as he was starting to show his potential though, he would immediately get traded to the Mavericks, where Donnie Nelson had recently been appointed the assistant general manager. Mavericks at this time had some great players. They had a young rookie big man from Germany called Dirk Nowitzki and an established veteran in Michael Finley. All they were missing was a playmaker at the point guard spot who could get the best out of these guys. When Nelson first joined the team, he would tell his dad Don, who was the head coach, "I've got your quarterback," and he's sitting behind those 2 guys, and they would soon trade for Nash. There was a lot of excitement in Steve's first season with the Mavericks, but unfortunately he would play through the season with a back fracture that wasn't detected until the end of the year, so as a result he and the team would struggle in the first season. In the next season he would again struggle with injuries. This time a problem with his ankles kept him out for 25 games, but when he came back things would start clicking. And by the end of the year, Dirk was looking like a future star, and Finley was performing like an all-star, while Steve would get 6 double-doubles in the last month of the NBA season. In Steve's third season with the Mavericks, things would take off like crazy, and he would become a bona fide star as he averaged 15.6 points and 7.3 assists a game, as he would lead the Mavericks to their first playoffs in 10 years. In their first round, they would beat the Utah Jazz, but in the second round, they would play the veteran San Antonio Spurs, and as expected, they would lose to them in 5 games. In the next season, Nash would only get better and go from a bona fide star to a true young star, as he led the best offense in the league, averaging 17.7 points and 7.9 assists while being named the All-Star and in the All-NBA third team. In the playoffs, they would do better than the previous year, this time reaching the semifinals where they would get beat by Sacramento. Steve and the team would run it back the next year, and he would lead them to the best offense in the league again while being named to an All-Star and to the All-NBA third team again. Steve would go through a gritty playoff run as they beat both the Trailblazers and Sacramento in 7 games to reach the conference finals, but unfortunately for them, they would play San Antonio and unfortunately failed to beat them again. Frustrated frustrated about coming up short 3 playoffs in a row, the Mavericks would trade for Antoine Jameson and Antoine Walker. While they would still have the best offense in the league, they weren't quite as good as they were in the previous years, as they only won 52 games with Nash not playing as well as he had previously. They would ultimately end up getting bounced in the first round. Nash would test free agency, and the expectations from most fans and journalists was he was going to test free agency but still end up re-signing with the team. Steve too wanted to return to the team, but the owner Mark Cuban was unwilling to give him a long-term deal, as he was now 30 years old with an injury history from early on in his career. To him, he was a tiny point guard with already not much athleticism who was coming off his worst season in 3 years, and that combined with his back and ankle issues meant that he could only go down from there for Nash. But this wasn't the first time somebody had doubted Nash, and there was still a team that believed in him, his old team Phoenix Suns. They were coming off of a 29-win season where they had traded away their point guards in Stephon Marbury and Penny Hardaway in the mid-season for an expiring contract in Antonio McDyess, which saved them money and opened up a spot at point guard. The Suns coaching staff were still big fans of Steve, as they witnessed his growth from a promising player in Phoenix to become a star with the Mavericks. They would even get to see him practice at their facilities every offseason, as Nash would come by to train with his former teammates. The Suns believed Steve's IQ and efficiency meant he would always make the right decisions, which would allow for the coach D'Antoni to run faster tempo offense, where unlike everybody else in the league who took up most of the shot clock every possession, he wanted to score as fast as possible, not letting defenses to get in position. Steve though wouldn't be as sure about returning to Phoenix, but Nash's friend and former teammate Rex Chapman was now working as a scout for the Suns, so he would convince him to meet with the team. The Suns would offer 6 years $63 million, which was both longer and more money per year than the 4-year $36 million deal that the Mavericks gave him. That would make the decision a lot easier for Nash, and he would rejoin the Suns. And while the Suns were coming off a 29-win year, they still had some exciting young players like Amari Stoudemire, who would become Nash's pick-and-roll partner, Sean Marion, who could defend any position on the court, and Joe Johnson and Quentin Richardson, who were both great scorers and shooters who could make threes. When Steve signed with the team, there weren't crazy expectations for him. Most thought he was a solid veteran player who could steady the ship, and before the season started, they were picked to finish last in the division. To everyone's surprise, the Suns would go on a crazy run to start the season, where it seemed like every game they played would turn out to be a shootout, and every time it seemed like it would be the Suns who came out on top, and they would be on top of the league after 35 games, going 31-4. Steve would be the massive reason the Suns would make this crazy turnaround, as D'Antoni's 7 seconds or less offense depended on Steve Nash's pick and roll with Amari Stoudemire. There were plenty of reasons why Nash was the perfect man to run this unique high output offense. One of them being his aggressive passing and willingness to always take risks to find open teammates for easy points. His ability to shoot and his rim pressure, which was rare for a tiny guard, made defenders switch on him, which would create a lot of chances for his teammates. This whole entire system though would run on Nash's pick and roll with Stoudemire, where they would force defenses to choose to cover either Amari or Nash. If they played high and covered Nash, Amari would be open on the roll, and if they were committed to Amari, Nash would pop the 3, which was especially effective because he had a very quick release, which meant that if defenses even gave him just a tiny window to shoot, he would be able to get the shot off. And the Suns ran this pick and roll more than any other team in the league, and nobody could stop it, so they would just run it over and over again. While this pick and roll was the focal point of their offense, they also had other tricks up their sleeve, as Steve Nash was also one of the best players in the league in isolation. He used head fakes and very quick low to the ground crossovers that was very hard to guard. And although Steve was undersized and dirty at this point, he was still one of the best finishers at the rim. He could use both hands to make contested layups and control his body in different directions to make tough paint shots, and also had a very effective one-footed floater he would use in pick and roll if defenders covered Amari. To describe just how important Nash was to this team, I'll bring you this stat. The Suns performed 14.9 points per 100 possessions better with Steve on the court, and the Suns posted a negative net rating when Steve was not on the court. Now with Steve on the team, all the young players on the team, as he, Amari Stoudemire, and Sean Marion would all make the All-Star team, while Joe Johnson and Quentin Richardson combined to average 32 points per game. All the while, Suns scored more threes than any team ever in the season and posted the best offensive rating since the 95-96 Bulls with this crazy high-paced offense. Nash himself though would have his best season ever, averaging 15.5 points and 11.5 9.5 assists a game, while shooting 50, 43, and 88, which earned him the MVP award, while D'Antoni would win the Coach of the Year and Brian Colangelo would win Executive of the Year award. While you may look at his points per game and wonder how he won the MVP, you gotta realize Steve Nash could have easily scored more points, but he was almost too generous to a fault where he always looked to create opportunities for others and would only shoot if he knew he had a very good chance of scoring, and his efficiency was a proof of that. I mean, 50, 40, 88 season is crazy. It's damn near a 50, 40, 90. And before Nash, only Reggie Miller, Mark Price, and Larry Bird had the 50, 40, 90 season. And funny enough, Steve Nash would have 4 50, 40, 90 seasons, all with the Suns, after everyone thought he was going to fall off. And 3 of them were back to back to back with the Suns. And he damn near had 5 straight. I mean, he missed out on a 50, 40, 90 this season by just 0.013% in free throws. In another season, he would need just 0.01% better on the free throws and he would have done it, but no other players even had more than 2 50, 40, 90 seasons, which just shows you how crazy efficient this guy was. Anyway, in the playoffs, the Suns would sweep the Grizzlies, but elsewhere, the Mavericks, who now had Jason Terry at point guard, would beat the Rockets in 7 games, which would create a matchup between the Suns and the Mavericks in the second round. In the first game, Steve would have a decent game, scoring 11 points and 13 assists, but his pick and roll partner Amari would have a huge game, scoring 40 points and 16 rebounds, as the Suns would win the game easily. In the next game, Steve would improve his scoring as he dropped 23 points and 13 assists, but this was uncharacteristically inefficient as he shot 9 for 22, and the Suns were down for most of the game until the Suns made a comeback in the fourth quarter as Steve would tie the game with a free throw to make the score 106 apiece. But Nowitzki would score a fadeaway over Richardson, and then Richardson would miss his attempt after, which would give Mavericks the win. Their third game would be a back and forth game with Nash scoring in pick and rolls and scoring tough shots every time the Mavericks tried to make a run, and eventually the Suns would take over as they would win the game 119 to 102 behind Steve's 27 points and 17 assists. In the 3 games so far in this round, Steve was doing well to create. He was averaging 14.3 assists a game, but was struggling to shoot as he only shot 2 for 12 from the 3. So the Mavericks head coach would come up with the plan to stop Nash from creating and force him to score. The Mavericks would put their big man Josh Howard on Steve Nash to execute this game plan, which would work. While Nash would score 48 points and shooting 20 for 28, he would only have 5 assists and 9 turnovers, and the Mavericks would end up winning the game 119 to 109. In the next game, the Mavericks would try to reuse this plan, this time putting their center Eric Dampier on Steve, but this time he would be able to score and create as he would have a triple-double, scoring 34 points with 12 assists and 13 rebounds, as the Suns were now winning the series 3-2. In game 6, the Suns would get off to a slow start and they would be down by 9 points at halftime, and then 16 with 4 minutes remaining in the third. But then Steve would lead the Suns to a comeback, and with 1:45 remaining in the game, Terry would miss a 3-pointer, which would set up Steve's full court pass to Shawn Marion for an and 1, which would cut the lead down to 2. And with 11.5 seconds remaining, the Suns would be down 3, with the Suns in possession. To end the game, Steve would go up the court and shoot right in Terry's face to tie the game, which would send the game into overtime, where the Suns would win and move on to the conference finals. In this round, they would face the Spurs, which would result in a real contrast in styles, as the run and gun Suns would face a slow and steady defense focused Spurs, and it would be the Spurs who would come out on top in this round. This elimination would result in doubt over the Suns, because people were now saying while the Suns were entertaining, their style wasn't great to win a championship because they shot too many threes, couldn't rebound or defend. The team would also lose couple key players right after this season, as the owner didn't want to pay Joe Johnson, so they would end up trading him away for Boris Diaw, and would also end up trading away Quentin Richardson. And to make everything worse, Amari Stoudemire would end up getting knee surgery beginning of the season, which meant he was out for the year. The Suns were now without 3 of their top players from the previous year, but worry not, they still had Steve Nash with a knack for improving everyone around him, and the Suns would continue to outscore everyone, as Diaw would win Most Improved Player of the Year, and free agent signing Raja Bell would shoot 44 from the 3, while Shawn Marion would have a career year. Nash would also have his best year yet, averaging 18.8 points, 10.5 assists, and 4.2 rebounds a game, while shooting 51, 43, and 92, as they won 54 games, with Steve winning another MVP. In the first round of the playoffs, they would go down 3-1 to the Lakers, but they would end up coming back to win in 7, and in the next round, they would win in 7 again against the Clippers, and would play play the Mavericks again in the conference final. Unfortunately, with no Amari, they had trouble guarding Dirk, and Nash would put up a valiant effort as they would lose in 6 games. The next season, they would get Amari back from the injury and improve upon their previous season, as Nash came close to three-peating MVP as he came second in voting. The Suns would beat the Lakers in the first round, but elsewhere, the number 1 seed Mavericks would lose to the Warriors, which meant that the only other serious contender left was the Spurs, as the East was very weak, and that's who the Suns would be taking on in the second round. The series was very competitive and was heading into 2-2 as the Suns were about to win Game 4, but then a serious changing moment would happen late in the game where Robert Horry would hip check Steve and send him flying into the announcer's table, which would cause Amari and Diaw to get up from the bench and defend their teammate. But somehow, the Suns ended up being the ones punished for this incident, as Amari and Diaw ended up being suspended for Game 5 for getting up from the bench, which is crazy. They didn't fight or anything, they still ended up being suspended. With Amari and Diaw suspended, the Suns would only score 85 points in Game 5, and they would lose again in Game 6, as the Spurs would reach the NBA Finals where they would win the NBA championship. This moment, I would say, was the defining moment where their championship window officially closed, because in the next season they would trade Marion for Shaq, which would slow the team down, and in the first round of the playoffs they would play the Spurs again, and they would play well in the first game as they would lead by 16 points at one point, and it seemed like they were going to win the game until Michael Finley hit a game-tying 3 with 15 seconds left and sent the game to overtime, where it seemed like the Suns were on the verge of winning again. But then Tim Duncan, out of all people, would hit a game-tying 3 to double overtime, and then Ginobili hit a tough shot to win the Spurs the game with 1 second left in the game. I mean, if Tim Duncan is shooting a game-tying 3 on you, then things are just not meant to be. Like, it was not in the script for the Suns to win this series. After missing the playoffs, the Suns would fire Terry Porter and bring in Alvin Gentry, who was an assistant under D'Antoni, and would bring in some of that 7 seconds or less back, and they would make the playoffs and reach all the way to the conference finals where they played the Lakers. And by Game 5, the series would be tied 2-2, with the Lakers taking an early lead by 25. But the Suns would come back to tie the game, and the Lakers would be in possession to end the game, where Kobe would shoot and airball a 3, but Ron Artest managed to grab the rebound and put it in as the time expired. The Lakers would end up winning the series, which would mark the end of Nash's time in Phoenix, as he would join the Lakers in the next year. But Nash's time in Los Angeles was unremarkable, as he was riddled with injuries and Steve Nash finally started to regress. And in 2015, Nash finally retired at the age of 41. While Steve Nash may have never had the scoring numbers you would have expected from a superstar who won multiple MVPs, Nash was one of the most influential players in the 2000s, as he and the Suns started the shift of the league, going small ball and playing faster tempo and shooting more threes. The Golden State Warriors would take this blueprint and start a dynasty of their own. I mean, it's no wonder why Nash joined the Warriors in 2015 as a consultant, and if it wasn't for some unlucky moments, Phoenix could have won a couple of championships themselves. Regardless, Nash's excellence can't be understated, and he was truly one of a kind player that showed you didn't need to be the most athletic or the biggest to become a star in the NBA.